Hi there, I'm Logan Medish, and this is High Caliber History. Today's a little bit different. The internet is full of so and so reacts to yada yada. Well, today is a very pertinent one. I'm titling it "Museum Professional Reacts to Forgotten Weapons." Ian dropped a video that's titled "It Belongs in a Museum" or "Ian Offends Curators." There's a lot of good stuff to go through in this video. And I will preface this by saying that I love Ian's work. I love what he's doing. I know him on a personal level. I'm fortunate enough if I text, he answers. We've interacted quite a bit. He even filmed a presentation I gave at the Cody Firearms Museum a couple of years ago. You can find that on his channel. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff that he brings up in this video. It belongs in a museum. Well, maybe, maybe not. And Ian offends curators. Again, maybe, maybe not. Anyway, let's get started and we'll get into it.
Oh, crap. Boy, they were not kidding about that soft Spanish steel.
Yeah, soft Spanish steel. That's funny.
That belongs in a museum, to quote the famous and notable archaeologist Indiana Jones. Well, these did belong in museums. Unfortunately, the Spanish government chose to have them crushed instead of preserved in museums, which is really quite unfortunate. These are the only two surviving known examples of this, which was a prototype design from the La Coruña arsenal in Spain when it didn't pass military muster. Instead of being preserved in a museum, the surviving examples were all crushed and destroyed. And it's only fortuitous that these two happened to get out of Spain, albeit already crushed to the height of the proverbial pancake.
God, prototype and crushed. Those are two words that should never go together.
But they're fascinating guns, and they have different features, and I can't show you any of that, really, because they are utterly and completely destroyed here. Now, what I want to talk about today is museums. A little bit tangential to this, but it made such a tragicomic cold open there that I couldn't resist. I have a hypothesis that museums have changed their focus basically since and because of the internet.
That's not a bad hypothesis, not a bad start. A lot of things have changed because of the internet, so it would make sense that museums have changed as well.
So, bear with me here. I think originally museums existed as a repository of knowledge, specifically for specialists. So if you were the botanist who spent 50 years collecting and indexing and preserving butterflies, that's the sort of collection that would go into a museum. And anyone else who is interested in the subject, and the more interested you were, the more detail you would want to see, and the more really weird and rare and exotic examples you would want to see. And that's why you went to a museum, is you could see either one really great collection, or better yet, multiple collections amalgamated together, and see everything there was to know about this, whatever the subject is, be it gemstones, butterflies, firearms, or anything else.
Okay, so we'll hold it there. Talking about the one guy who spent 50 years putting together the collection of butterflies or gemstones or guns or whatever. Yes, that's how a lot of museums started and got their collections, was, from an individual putting together their life's work into an amazing collection. But I think it's important to note that a lot of times that 50 years worth of life's collection, yeah, it was one guy, but it was one guy who worked for the museum. Or was working on behalf of the museum, not necessarily just one individual who was really into butterflies or gemstones or guns, who collected stuff, who said to himself, this is going to be the collection that'll go into a museum one day. And if you're the type of collector out there who's thinking like that, that's problematic, because not everything belongs in a museum.
Basically, everything that your society knew about this subject would be on display in a museum. And that's the point of a museum, is to take one person's collection and knowledge and make it available to everyone and pass that knowledge along.
No, see, we'll stop again. Not taking one person's collection of knowledge and putting it on display. If you are collecting for the sole purpose of putting your entire collection into a museum, let alone on display in a museum someday, you are collecting for the wrong reasons. Yes, there are a lot of galleries named after individuals who have amazing collections, but that is the exception. That is not the rule.
Today, museums, and I apologize, don't take this personally, the museum curators I know and respect who are possibly watching this, today museums are much more
Won't take
like
it personally.
three-dimensional Wikipedia entries. That's perhaps a bit harsh, but museums, instead of catering to the specialist, museums now cater to a pretty low common denominator. They cater to
All right, so catering to a pretty low common denominator. Yes, that is absolutely true. But to say that that is a recent development or an internet related development, absolutely not true. Museums have always catered to the lowest common denominator.
the average family, mother, father, 2.5 children on vacation, where kind of no one really wants to go to any particular place, but you make compromises. So dad gets to go to the gun museum, and then after that they're going to go to the Museum of Modern Art or any number, whatever else everyone else in the family wants to do. And the museum does its best to be relevant and interesting to the whole family by reducing its level of specialization to a very generalized, simplistic approach. You can walk into a World War II museum knowing basically nothing about World War II, and you can leave with a pretty good understanding of the basics, of the timeline. Here's what happened when, and you'll see some neat human interest stories about some people who were in the war and what their experiences were like. But frankly, it's not that much different than what you would gain if you read the Wikipedia article on World War II.
So again, to go back to lowest common denominator, absolutely, and the museums have to appeal to the lowest common denominator, and that's for a number of reasons. But the main reason is we're talking sheer numbers. A museum cannot survive without people coming through the door, paying admission fees, or buying things in the gift shop, things of that nature. So they have to have that kind of 10,000 foot view of things. Yes, there are museums that specialize in very specific topics and things of that nature, but more often than not, those museums are very small. They are privately funded, and their attendance is very, very small. Likewise, now of course, there are some exceptions to that. Very specific museums like the Cody Firearms Museum or the NRA Museum and stuff like that are specialized and they are larger. But that is not the norm when it comes to museums. So, yes, museums do cater to the lowest common denominator because it's about volume and about getting the most number of people you can get through the door on any given day.
Sure, you will see some of these things, physical objects, in a way that you couldn't do on the computer, and you may be able to see video or voice recordings of people who are involved in the events, which you may or may not be able to do online. But you don't get the detail. If you are a very interested specialist in World War II and you walk into that museum, the chances are you're not really going to leave with anything you didn't already know. And that's like the exact opposite of how museums used to be.
Now, see, this I'm going to have to disagree with. I don't think that's how museums used to be. I think museums, by and large, for a very long time, have operated to appeal to the masses, not appealing to the specialist. You certainly want the specialist to come there and to be interested, and that's why they can and should make appointments with the staff to see the collection in a more in depth manner. But I think to say that museums used to be more specialized as a generalization as a whole is not true.
And my hypothesis is that the internet has basically replaced the museum as the repository of societal knowledge.
The internet has not replaced museums as the source of societal knowledge. I think museums have attempted to contribute to that access online of societal knowledge. But to say that the internet has replaced it, I think is not quite accurate, because oftentimes a lot of the good information you're getting off the internet, some of that is coming from a museum.
No, even the best old arms museum couldn't really compete with the amount of firearms information and diversity that's available on the internet today. I can go to, not to toot my own horn, but I can go to my own YouTube channel and find a vast array of interesting and unusual firearms. I can go to discussion boards and talk to collectors all over the world who are serious, dedicated, passionate specialists in their own particular fields of firearm collecting, and learn a tremendous amount of information, more than any individual museum could ever hope to combine into one place and actually display.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And, Ian should absolutely toot his own horn on this. The Forgotten Weapons channel is absolutely phenomenal. There is stuff on that channel that you will not find anywhere else. You could literally travel the world trying to see all of that stuff, and you could see some of it, but you couldn't see all of it. But I think it's important to remember here, and I know Ian knows this and he hasn't forgotten this, but a decent chunk of the guns that he has shown us on his channel have come from museums. And he's been fortunate enough to get access to the museum collections to be able to create the content to show it to the rest of the world. So yes, the internet has made that information easier to access, but without the museum, the information wouldn't have been there for him to access in the first place.
And so the utility of a museum has really decreased. It used to be, if I wanted to see that great butterfly collection, I would be willing to, I'd save up my vacation time and I'd travel and I'd go to the place with that museum specifically so that I could see the museum collection and learn as much as I could there. And I'd probably make trips back, regularly. As I learned more, some of the elements of the collection become more and more relevant and more interesting, and all of a sudden, like, oh, I understand this, and I'm able to make connections between this area of the field and that area. And today, we can do that on the internet. There's no need to try to drive across country and visit far-flung locations with little obscure museums, because it's all available online.
Well, yes and no. The majority of stuff is available online, but again, he mentioned obscure little museums. Those are the places that often don't have the staffing or the money to be able to digitize their collection and put it online. So to a certain extent, yeah, you probably are still going to need to travel to some of these places in order to see the objects.
And so in order to remain relevant, and in order to expand their appeal, museums reduce their level of specificity and they become much more generalized, to the point that anyone can walk into the museum and have an enjoyable time and learn something, but they're appealing to the general audience and not to the specialists anymore.
And again, yeah, they're appealing to the general audience, not to the specialist, because like Ian said, anyone can walk in and have a good time. You don't want people to walk into your museum, spend some time in there, and then leave and have had a bad time. Regardless of what the topic of the museum is or the content, you want people to have a good time. And again, museums, I don't think museums have become less specialized in their exhibits. I think they've always been generalized in their exhibits. Now, there may be very specialized exhibits that come on display temporarily here and there, but I think generally speaking, as a whole, museums have always been appealing to the masses and less so to the specialist in terms of what's on display.
And so I think that is the reason why we have very few good arms museums anymore. And there are a few that are extremely good. The Cody Firearms Museum in particular, the NRA Museum there are two of the few museums left.
Yeah, so thanks for the shout out to the NRA Museum. I worked there for a number of years, the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, and the National Sporting Arms Museum at the Bass Pro headquarters in Springfield, Missouri. There's a lot of great guns on display in those two museums. Again, I might be a little biased from having worked there, but thanks for the shout out, Ian. Appreciate it.
Out there that have just a whole ton of guns all over the place, because it's a gun museum and you came here to see guns, and for goodness sake, you're going to see a lot of guns. Even those
Yeah.
museums, however, tend to have more guns in the back in the reserve vault than they do actually on display. And that's largely just because of logistics. The building just isn't big enough to display every physical example that they have. And unfortunately, in most places, in most museums, the more rare and unusual a particular gun is, the less likely it's actually going to get out on display, because the more rare and unusual it is, the less most people are going to know about it, the less it was probably actually used in any sort of large scale. The Vietnam War, for example, if you go to a museum that has a display on the Vietnam War, or an entire museum dedicated to the Vietnam War, there are going to be some guns in there, but you're almost certainly going to see an AK, an M16, and an M60. You will not see a whole bunch of weird SPIW project prototypes, because while they are of the correct era, no one knows what they were. They don't appeal to the generalists. They were never actually used in Vietnam. And so they are, for us, the specialists, the most interesting things, and they are the most likely to be back in the vaults.
Now, see, I would totally disagree with that. Museums that have really rare and impressive pieces, like SPIW stuff, that stuff's going to be on display because that becomes a centerpiece and a showpiece of the collection and of the exhibit. If I was curating an exhibit on Vietnam and I had access to some SPIW program stuff, yeah, I'm putting that stuff on display because even though it is geared more towards the specialist than the generalist, where else are you going to learn about something like that, right? Most SPIW stuff is in museums. So if you make it available to the public in an exhibit, then they go, wow, that was great. I learned something I didn't know. You probably go through and a basic amount about the M16, the AK, and the M60. But to come through and see some SPIW stuff, now you've really learned something, whether you're a generalist or a specialist.
Now, the other common problem with firearms in museum settings is the guns are not accessible to that internet community that has become the shared repository of social knowledge. And what I mean when I say that is, yeah, the guns are there and they're physically protected. There are some terrible museums that don't take good care of their guns, but as a general rule, museums do an excellent job of preserving and maintaining artifacts in their possession because they're run by museum curators, and that's their profession, is curating and preserving and protecting artifacts. The problem is, they're not, when guns are in private ownership, people are interested in, their owners are interested in them and excited about them and are very likely and have the ability to take pictures and ask questions and share these guns and their details and their photos and their interests with other collectors and historians and researchers. And information circulates. And if I have a question about something in particular, I can easily write up a private collector who has direct and immediate access to that gun. And frankly, I'll probably get multiple collectors who all have a couple examples, and we can put together a really good batch of knowledge and come to a better understanding of something.
Yes, absolutely. And that is a great example of private collections and private collectors and being able to utilize what they have and tap into their enthusiasm. I think a lot of, like Ian said, a lot of collectors, they essentially are curators of their own collection. And there are a lot of individual collector groups out there that I think is very, very beneficial for people to be a member of and to be a part of because it is a remarkable community.
When guns are back in museum vaults, the first issue is nobody necessarily knows that they're there. Now, there are some museums, like the Cody Firearms Museum, that know what are in their vaults and they're very good with allowing access to it. But that's not the case for most museums, where they're tragically understaffed. The curator's time is pretty much entirely spent on, first off, museum bureaucracy and paperwork, but then actually just maintaining the collection and taking care of things. And they don't have time to be doing a lot of detailed research into the specific individual items in their collections. This sounds counterintuitive, but it's kind of like people who are professionals in the firearms industry don't really have time to do any shooting anymore. professionals in the museum industry, generally speaking, don't have the time to do any research on the items in their collections.
Yeah, see, I disagree with that. Museum staff, they know for the most part what is in their collections, and they do have time to be working on research and writing, and I think you'll find that with a number of museum professionals that they do put out content both in magazine articles, journal articles. Or you could take it a step further. There are some museums that the curators are putting out videos and/or podcasts related to what's in their collection. Yeah, no one ever has enough time, but I think if someone is going to try to hide behind the excuse of, well, I don't have time to get to the things that are in my collection to do any research with them, I think that's a cop out on the part of the curator or the museum professional.
And so a gun that is donated to a museum and put in the reserve vault will probably never be seen again, where if that gun remained in private hands, it won't always be. There are plenty of private collectors who are secretive or uninterested in sharing anything, but there's an equal chance that it will go to someone who will share it and will basically contribute that information to the collective pool of knowledge. And so it's kind of a roll of the dice, but in a way the museum is the safe option, but it's also the one that almost guarantees that the gun won't be accessible, the artifact won't be accessible to people. And
Yeah, he's absolutely right. There is far too many museum objects across all museum disciplines. Doesn't matter what they collect. That they have way more than they can put on display. That they way more than they would ever need to put on display. And that's the importance of a museum having a very good scope of collections and a very good accession plan to determine exactly what they're going to bring in and know what they're going to need to have and want to put on display. Just because someone offers X, Y, or Z to you doesn't mean you should take it. Just because it's free doesn't mean you need it. Otherwise, you end up with a vast number of things that have no business being in your collection because either A, they don't meet the scope, or B, do you really need 75 Winchester Model 70s or 56 wooden training rifles, things of that nature?
it's unfortunate, and I know I'm going to get some pushback from museum curator friends of mine who may well be watching this, but and it doesn't apply to every museum out there. But I think there's an expectation among the general public that the museum system is a panacea for, well, we don't necessarily have to have collectible guns. Maybe these are particularly dangerous collectible guns, or some people think so. And so let's just put them all in museums. And the reality is, putting them all in museums will kill their accessibility to historical research as much as destroying them will in most places.
Yep, absolutely. That's painfully true in a lot of instances.
And that kind of brings us full circle back to these poor destroyed military prototypes, and frankly also to this guy. This is an A76L. It's an Astra pistol. It was a prototype design. A total of 29 of them were made for evaluation by the Policia Nacional in Spain. Only a handful of them survive anymore, and this one has a giant slot cut in the barrel because that was necessary to keep it legal according to Spanish deactivation requirements, which, when they were first introduced, seemed reasonable, or would have seemed reasonable to a lot of people. To me, this is still unfortunate, tragic destruction of a nice historical artifact. But the idea that we'll just cut a hole in the barrel, maybe a really big hole, and so it can't be used anymore, and then it's deactivated, and now it's okay. Well, that's fine, I guess. It's still wrong, but it gets done. But the problem is it doesn't stop there, and deactivation procedures are being changed regularly and increased in strictness and their level of destruction of the artifact. And so today, this pistol is not legal in Spain in its current form. It would be considered the same as a fully live functional gun. And in order to be considered deactivated, now all of the moving parts have to be welded in place. The lips have to be cut off the magazines. The guns have to be well and truly destroyed. The same thing is true in England. Old deactivation standards allowed you to at least have some moving parts and disassemble a piece. You could learn something from it. Today, the deactivation standard is, again, basically welding the thing into a solid chunk of steel. We see it in Japan. There's a good reason that Arasaka collectors are pretty much all in the United States. In Japan, the deactivation standards for a Japanese rifle are so strict that the guns basically have to be welded into completely solid, non-moving chunks of steel. And you lose so much of the history doing that. I mean, even at one end, you have to be able to fire a gun to really actually understand it. I've had more than a few instances when design elements of a firearm that seemed odd or coincidental, or that I didn't even notice in the first place, their purpose became immediately obvious upon actually shooting the firearm. The idea that you can learn everything there is to know about a gun and other artifacts in other fields as well, just by looking at it in a glass case, is, I think, fundamentally flawed. And a lot of deactivation standards, should they become universally applied, pose a serious risk to the health of the historical and collecting community. So.
Yeah, he's absolutely right. Deactivation standards are changing frequently throughout the world, and they're having huge impacts on museum collections. The first one that comes to my mind, I wrote an article about it a couple years ago over at the Firearm blog. I'll put a link in the description, about changing standards at the Lithgow Museum with their collection, and they were going to basically have to turn the guns into just giant blobs of welded metal. Despite having met the previous criteria, the government was changing their mind on a whim, and it would lead to the utter destruction of these guns that had been placed into a museum for their safekeeping to begin with.
Anyway, I've kind of wandered off track a little bit. Hopefully I didn't offend too many museum folks here. Museums are still valuable institutions, but I think they've changed. I think their nature has changed over basically since the internet really became a common thing.
Yeah, museums absolutely have changed since the internet became a thing. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, and not offended by it at all.
Now, is our internet community doing better than museums used to? That's an interesting question that I'm not going to touch on right now. I've offended enough people as it is. So,
well, if you're offending people, you're doing something right. I think the internet community, it's not necessarily doing better than the museums, but they're helping the museums. Rising tide raises all ships, and I think we're all in it together. Whether you're a private collector or you're a museum, being able to have access to the internet and the social media sites, and being able to make the collections available to researchers, whether that's on an individual basis, whether that's stuff published by curators, or by having guys like Ian come and check out the items in the collection. Again, the rising tide raises all ships.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I would be interested to hear your thoughts on the subject. So hit me up in the comments. Let's have a discussion about it. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, he's absolutely right. There's a lot of great points in this video that he hit home on. A lot of really good stuff in there. Certainly, yeah, there's some things I disagree with. Ian and I, we kind of exist in slightly different worlds. We kind of overlap in a bit of a Venn diagram, with me having the worked in museums and worked in that bureaucracy and stuff. But yeah, so I'm very curious. I would love to know in the comments section what you think. Where do you fall in this argument? What pluses and minuses do you see to the stuff that Ian has said and the stuff that I've said? Definitely want to keep this conversation going. It's not something that we're going to see an end to anytime soon. All right, well, thanks for watching the video. I really hope you enjoyed it. The whole purpose is for your enjoyment. That's why we're doing this stuff here. So if you feel like you'd like to support what we're doing here, there's a link to Patreon in the description below. And please share this video with someone who you think might enjoy seeing the stuff like this, and make sure that you're subscribed and click the bell to get the notifications.